This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 572 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the transactions this week, I wanted to remind you that FanDuel is giving new users an exclusive offer to play NFL Daily Fantasy for free all season long. All you have to do is sign up for FanDuel Daily Fantasy, and you'll receive one free voucher for each remaining week of the NFL season. You'll get your voucher upon sign up to FanDuel Daily Fantasy, and vouchers will automatically apply to each weekly entry. Head over to FanDuel.com and sign up to play Daily Fantasy Football. Eligibility restrictions apply. New users only. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Let's get to these transactions. Add Jeremy McNichols and Adrian Peterson. So the big news that dropped on Monday was that Derrick Henry has a foot injury. He's reportedly going to be out between 6 to 10 weeks. So obviously the Titans need to fill this hole because Derrick Henry was averaging over 27 rush attempts per game. Teams usually divvy that up between 2 or 3 running backs, but they were just giving it all to Henry. I'm now expecting the Titans to split their backfield up. Let's look at Jeremy McNichols first. He's the guy who was on this Titans team before Monday. And he's been utilized as a pass catcher out of that backfield throughout the season. He actually has a 10.6% target share this year. And he's had some games where that number spiked. He's had some decent enough outings in PPR formats this year. Now, meanwhile, the Titans also signed Adrian Peterson on Monday. If I'm forecasting this backfield, my assumption is that Peterson's going to be the early down guy and the goal line guy, with Jeremy McNichols seeing some of that early down work. Because again, we shouldn't expect Adrian Peterson to see Derrick Henry's workload. And keep in mind that Peterson's not that much of a pass catcher. He's never been much of a pass catcher. So he sort of complements Jeremy McNichols pretty well. Both players need to be added off the waiver wire this week, because we don't know exactly how this is going to really shape up. But I think I would prefer McNichols over Peterson, because most of you guys are playing in PPR formats. And McNichols should maintain that receiving work, all while seeing more early down work. Peterson, though, should be added still. And if there's anything that he's taught us through the years, it's to never count him out. Buy Leonard Fournette. So Leonard Fournette had a down game in Week 8. He carried the ball just 8 times for 26 yards. He did see 5 targets, but he didn't do a whole lot with them. I'm calling him out this week just to say that he's still a high-end option at running back. Don't worry. He's seen a double-digit percentage target share in all but one game this year, and his running back rush share is still a solid 65%. It was a tough matchup against the Saints. The Saints have been good against running backs this year, and they've been good against running backs over the last few years. The other thing to keep in mind with Tampa Bay is that they're playing a little bit above expectation in pass-to-rush touchdown ratio this year. They've thrown for significantly more touchdowns than they've run for. They have 25 passing touchdowns and 7 rushing touchdowns. That gives them one of the highest pass-to-rush touchdown ratios in the league. Now, I get it. Look at their personnel. Of course that's going to be the case. But they also had 4 passing touchdowns to 0 rushing touchdowns this past week. Moving forward, that number's not going to be like that. We even saw that after the first couple of weeks of the season. Now, I get it. Tampa Bay's doing something that we historically just haven't really seen. We can't really apply history to this Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense. But we also shouldn't assume that they're going to throw for every touchdown from here on out. So it's another good reason to buy Fournette after this down game. Add Jordan Howard and Boston Scott. So it was a bad week for Kenneth Gainwell and for anyone who added Kenneth Gainwell entering Week 8. If you look at the Philadelphia box score, you'll see a pretty big split with that Eagles backfield, with Kenneth Gainwell, Boston Scott, and Jordan Howard. Gainwell actually saw the most rush attempts in that game against Detroit on Sunday. He had 13, Boston Scott had 12, and Jordan Howard had 12. But 12 of Gainwell's 13 rush attempts came in the fourth quarter of that game. And if you watch that game, the Eagles were way, way ahead. It was a super, super positive game script, aka garbage time. And not only that, but Gainwell failed to see a target for the first time all season on Sunday. But I think the big takeaway here is that game script matters a lot. That game script allowed both Boston Scott and Jordan Howard to come through with top 15 fantasy performances at running back. Boston Scott was a little bit more involved than Jordan Howard was because he had a target, but both players were involved in the first half. Boston Scott got the start and Jordan Howard saw a lot of work in the second quarter. But I think we can look at this and say this is pretty unsustainable. The Eagles aren't going to face the Lions every week, so we can't expect them to play with a lead like they did on Sunday. In other words, we should not expect Jordan Howard and Boston Scott to keep up this pace. Now, if the question is who should you add off the waiver wire, I would say Boston Scott first. He was seeing work at the beginning of that game. But I do think in deeper formats, you can still add Jordan Howard as long as Miles Sanders is sidelined. And for the record, don't just automatically drop Kenneth Gainwell either. Philadelphia didn't have to play catch-up against Detroit. They might have to against the Chargers in Week 9. This backfield really is a mess until Miles Sanders comes back. If you recall, a couple of weeks ago, I talked about Miles Sanders being a buy candidate in fantasy football, and then he got hurt. But I still kind of feel that way. Because what if this is the game that the Philadelphia Eagles coaching staff sits back and they say, we got to give our running backs a little bit more action? That's going to help Miles Sanders down the stretch. And the Eagles have a very, very good schedule. So I think Miles Sanders is still kind of a buy if you want an extra transaction within this transaction. I just inceptioned you. Hold or buy Devontae Smith. So speaking of the Eagles, let's talk about Devontae Smith. He's averaged just 6.2 PPR points per game over his last 3 contests. And he's coming off a game against Detroit where he caught just one of his 3 targets for 15 yards. Now, if you want some good news, he's still seeing a good target share. During this 3-game stretch, his target share per game has been 21.5%. That's not far off from his season-long 22.8% share. Now, obviously, in an offense like Philadelphia, you're not seeing as good of targets as an offense like Tampa Bay. A 22% target share in Tampa Bay is a lot more valuable. I'm just showing you that Devontae Smith has been involved within his offense, and that's a good thing. Now, if you have Devontae Smith, the next couple of weeks are going to be tough. The Eagles get the Chargers in Week 9 and then the Broncos in Week 10. Those are 2 teams that look really good against wide receivers, according to my schedule-adjusted fantasy points allowed method. After that, though, they don't have a single tough matchup for wide receivers in adjusted fantasy points allowed through the end of the fantasy season. And in weeks 15 and 17, 2 very, very important weeks for fantasy football, Philadelphia faces Washington. That's a team that currently ranks as the most advantageous matchup for opposing wide receivers. You might not want to start Devontae Smith over the next couple of weeks, but he's got a chance to be usable down the stretch, especially in deeper formats. That's why he's both a hold and a buy. Buy Brandon Aiyuk. So context is always important with every single transaction. That's why I talk about every transaction. And that's no different with this one. Don't trade anything for Brandon Aiyuk. He still has not been consistently productive. He's only seen 10.8% of San Francisco's targets this year. But the peripherals are getting better. Aiyuk played 87.5% of the 49ers snaps on Sunday. That's a season high. He saw 25.9% of the team's targets. That's another season high. And he converted his 7 targets into 45 receiving yards, which, you guessed it, another season high. The fact that he didn't blow up statistically, that's a very good thing if you're looking to trade for him. Because his managers may not see the upward trend in usage, and they might just look at production. And that's not the proper way to evaluate these things. Usage is everything. And as long as Aiyuk's workload is trending in the right direction, we should be willing to send off some bench assets to get him. We've seen him be a productive wide receiver in the past. The fact that you don't have to give up that much to acquire him, and we're seeing this usage trend up, that's a good thing. Add Carlos Hyde. So there's a chance that we don't see James Robinson in Week 9 because of a heel injury that he had against the Seahawks. But the good news is that it sounds like it's not that serious. You still want to get Carlos Hyde, though, just in case. Because he had 9 of Jacksonville's 11 non-James Robinson running back rushes in that game against Seattle, and he had a 15.7% target share. If Robinson misses time, Hyde could be a decent flex play based on volume alone, even in a tough matchup against the Bills. Add Jarrett Patterson. So Antonio Gibson wasn't on Washington's Week 8 injury report for the first time in weeks. So of course in Week 8, that was the week where he hit a season-low 36% running back rush share. Fantasy football can be so freaking annoying sometimes. Washington has a bye in Week 9, so hopefully Gibson can sit back, relax, and rest. He needs to get healthy. But it's still worth adding Jarrett Patterson, because he handled half of Washington's running back rushes against Denver on Sunday. And you never know with injuries. What if this Gibson injury continues to linger? And what if Washington keeps losing? If they keep losing, why would they throw their stud running back on the field and sacrifice his future? So there is some worry with Gibson right now. There's a lot of worry. That's why you're adding Patterson. Hold Michael Carter. So I think the initial reaction to Michael Carter's monster game on Sunday would be to sell him. He had 32 PPR points against the Bengals. He's not going to do that again this season, more than likely. But that's easy. It's easy to say, go sell Michael Carter. That's not the way the fantasy football world works. No one is sitting there saying, I really, really want this New York Jets running back. So in a hypothetical world, sure, sell Michael Carter. He's seen a 25% target share per game over his last two. He's had 23 targets over his last two games. There's almost a 0% chance. In fact, I'll just say there's a 0% chance that he's going to maintain that pace through the rest of the season. But no normal, sane fantasy manager is making that assumption. And to be honest, even if we accept that receiving volume is going to dip, Michael Carter can still be usable through the rest of the season. Since week 2, Carter's averaged a running back rush share per game of 68.5%. That's pretty good. Before these last 2 weeks where he's seen an inflated target share, he's been getting roughly 9% of New York's targets. That's not terrible. It's not like his usage was 0 and then he had this blow-up game. And not only that, the Jets have been much less of a dumpster fire offensively. They scored a grand total of 2 offensive touchdowns across their first 3 games this year, but they've scored 11 in their last 4. We want attempts and we want targets in fantasy football. Michael Carter is getting those things. So despite coming off this big game, because the market's likely not going to be there for Michael Carter. So despite coming off this game, I think he's more of a hold. Add Jamal Agnew. So on last week's Sleeper Show, I talked about Jamal Agnew. He came through. He had a 6-catch, 38-yard, 1-touchdown performance against Seattle. The Jags have now been without DJ Chark for 3 weeks. In those 3 games, Agnew has averaged a target share per game of 20.8% while leading the Jacksonville Jaguars in targets. The volume alone means that Agnew should be added. Buy Jarvis Landry. Look, Jarvis Landry's boring. He's just moderately productive, but he is inexpensive. He's been back from an injury for 2 weeks now. In those contests, he's seen 18 targets and a 28.6% target share per game. He has been super productive in fantasy with just 18.7 total PPR points over those 2 contests, but Cleveland also was facing Denver and Pittsburgh. Those are 2 teams that at least have defensive pieces that can stop opposing offenses. And one of those games was with Case Keenum. The Browns also keep scoring their touchdowns via the ground, at a pace that they're likely not going to maintain. Their pass-to-rush touchdown ratio this year is 0.5. That's tied with Chicago for the lowest in the league. The smallest ratio that we've seen over the last decade is 0.59. And the average across those 10 seasons is 2.23. If and when Cleveland's pass-to-rush touchdown ratio regresses, it's going to benefit the pass catchers on that team. So I think that Landry should be able to give you wide receiver 3 type numbers in PPR formats as long as he's healthy. And sometimes that's fine for deeper rosters. Add Pat Freiermuth. So Freiermuth was another player that I talked about on the Sleeper Show, and he also came through. He saw 20% of Pittsburgh's targets this past week without Eric Ebron in that lineup, and he turned that into 4 catches for 44 yards and a score. He now has back-to-back games with at least an 18% target share, and he played at least 60% of Pittsburgh's snaps in both of those games. And those games just happened to coincide with Juju Smith-Schuster's season-ending injury. Now, Freiermuth's not running the same number of routes as like a Chase Claypool or Deontay Johnson, but he's a big-time red zone threat. He should continue to see opportunity with Juju Smith-Schuster out for the year. So I think he's a priority for teams who need tight ends this week. Sell Noah Fant. Noah Fant's actually having a pretty strong year. He's top 10 in PPR points per game at tight end, and he's seen nearly 20% of Denver's targets throughout the season. But I would be lying if I sat here and told you that I'm not nervous about Jerry Jeudy and Alberto returning to that lineup, because they're healthy again. In week 8, with both Jeudy and Alberto back, Fant saw his lowest target share since facing Pittsburgh in week 5. And he also ran a route on 70% of Denver's dropbacks. That's the lowest rate of the season for him. And I think that route participation, that's key. With Alberto healthy weeks 1 through 4, Fant averaged a routes per dropback rate of 76.3%. That shot up to 88% without Alberto. And then it came crashing back down this past week when Alberto returned. I think it's just going to be tough for Noah Fant to maintain that 20% target share that he had been seeing over the last month. If you compare him with a bench asset to upgrade the tight end position, I would do it. Buy Derek Carr. So I don't typically trade for quarterbacks in fantasy football, especially non-elite quarterbacks. But some of you might be in a tough spot at the position, and Derek Carr might be able to help. Carr's been a top 15 fantasy quarterback in points per game this year. And I think he's going to see a boost over the next handful of weeks because of Vegas' schedule. Over the team's next 7 games, the only opponent that ranks in the top half of the league in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks is Dallas. The Raiders have plus matchup after plus matchup after plus matchup for Derek Carr. Go Google their schedule right now. Go check it out. It's crazy. So I would not be surprised if Derek Carr is a top 10 option over the next month and a half as a result. Add Taysom Hill. Jameis Winston tore his ACL on Sunday. He's done for the season. Now, Taysom Hill's been out the last few weeks with a concussion, but he could be back in week 9. Perfect timing. Because if that's the case, Hill becomes a really intriguing fantasy football option. He started 4 games last year. In those games, he averaged over 21 fantasy points per game, and he scored no fewer than 17.5 points. He was QB 13 or better in weekly scoring every single week. And we know it's because of what he can do with his legs. He's got that cheat code element to his game. During his 4 starts, he averaged 52 rushing yards per game, and he found the end zone on the ground 4 times. And in week 9, the Saints get the Falcons. As we all know, Atlanta's one of the better matchups for quarterbacks this year. Add the Miami Dolphins defense. The Dolphins are a good streamer this week. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, Miami's a 7-point favorite against Houston. They're likely going to be playing with a positive game script. And Houston's been a top 10 team for opposing defenses when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. Now we'll see what happens with Tyrod Taylor. Maybe he starts this week. Maybe he's back. But I still think regardless, Miami's a pretty strong waiver wire option. The 16th transaction this week that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to add Tua Tagovailoa. Tua's another viable quarterback streamer this week because he faces the Texans. And he's actually not been that bad in fantasy since returning from injury. Over the last 3 weeks, he's scored 21.4, 26.5, and 15.2 standard fantasy points. And that lower total of 15.2, that came against one of the toughest opponents in the league in the Bills. Houston is not that. Houston's been a top 10 opponent for quarterbacks this year. And Tua has shown us that he has a ceiling when facing these bad opponents. That's what we saw against Jacksonville and Atlanta. So I think he's a strong streaming option this week if you're needing a quarterback. I'd prefer Taysom Hill if we knew that he was getting the start, but Tua is a pretty safe choice. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you tomorrow.